My voice cut through the NBC studio like it always did, clean, certain, unhesitating. Our next guest is the most watched film star in the world right now. The audience responded the way they always do when they already know what they're about to see, with pleasure, with recognition, with that particular warmth people reserve for something that has already proven itself. Charles Bronson walked out from behind the curtain, crossed the stage the way he crossed every stage, measured, contained, carrying nothing visible, and settled into the chair across from me with the expression that had earned him a fortune and a legend. Still, controlled, certain.
He had, by that point, appeared on screens in more countries than most actors could name. His face had been pressed onto posters in Paris, Tokyo, Rome, and Buenos Aires before most Americans had bothered to learn his name. He was 52 years old when Death Wish turned him into a symbol for an entire decade's rage, and he had worn that symbol with the same expressionless efficiency with which he had worn everything else. The most private man in Hollywood, sitting under the brightest lights in television, performing exactly what was expected of him. What no one in that studio could see, what no one was supposed to see, was what he was carrying back to the hotel that night, what was waiting at home, the thing that none of the training, none of the discipline, none of the decade of controlled silence had prepared him for. Because Charles Bronson had spent his entire life learning one lesson above all others: hold your face still, make no sound, keep moving. It was the lesson of the mines, and the war, and the years of nothing before the world noticed him. And it had worked. It had worked for 50 years, until it didn't. Have you ever watched someone you love face something that none of your strength could touch and had to sit very still and say nothing about it? Leave a comment below, because that question is at the center of everything this man was. He was born Charles Dennis Bushinsky on November 3rd, 1921 in Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, a place that does not appear on most maps of America and was never meant to. Ehrenfeld was a company town in Cambria County, built around the Lehigh Valley Coal Company's needs and organized entirely around one fact: there was coal in the ground, and men were needed to get it out. The town did not have a skyline. It had a shaft entrance. The streets ran between identical frame houses, and the air carried the particular gray quality of a place where the earth is always being opened, and something is always being taken from it. Walter Bukinski had come from Lithuania with nothing but a name and the knowledge that the mines would take him. He married Mary Valinsky, and together they filled the house on Ehrenfeld's narrow streets with children, 15 of them, of which Charles was the 11th. In a household that size, in a coal town during the 1920s, the mathematics of survival were not abstract. They were daily. They were the difference between a full plate and a half-empty one. They were the choice between heating the bedroom or the kitchen. Charles Bukinski grew up understanding, before he understood much else, that the world did not issue guarantees. It issued coal cars and time card punches, and occasionally nothing at all. Walter died when Charles was roughly 10 years old. The exact circumstances shifted slightly across different tellings over the years, but the central fact remained constant. The man who had held the household together was gone, and what was left was a widow, 14 children, and the specific silence that descends on a house when the person who was supposed to fix things is no longer there to fix them. Charles went to work. This was not a decision so much as an inevitability. By his early teens, he was in the mines himself, earning $1 per ton, a wage that sounds like a number and feels when you carry it like a weight. He told a story once, in one of the rare interviews where something real surfaced, about wearing his sister's dress to school, not as a joke, not as a colorful detail for a profile, because he had no other clothes, because that was the actual condition of the household, and the actual condition demanded an actual response, and the response was to put on what was available and walk to school anyway. If the other children said something, he did not record what he said back. He probably said nothing. He was already learning the lesson. What was the first moment you understood that the world didn't owe you anything, and what did you do with that understanding? Drop it in the comments. Because for Charles Bukinski, that moment came early, and everything that followed was built on top of it. He enlisted in 1943. The Army Air Forces assigned him to the 20th Air Force as a tail gunner on a B-29 Superfortress, and he flew 25 combat missions over the Pacific. A B-29 tail gunner sat in a pressurized bubble at the rear of the aircraft, separated from the rest of the crew, responsible for the most exposed position on the plane. The statistical reality of those missions was not encouraging. Bronson never spoke about the war at length, which was, for men of that generation and that background, not unusual. What the war left him with was harder to name than a wound. It was more like a calibration, a permanent adjustment of the threshold between fear and function. He came home in 1945 and used his GI Bill benefits to study art, first in Philadelphia, then in California. This detail tends to get lost in the later mythology of the squinting gunfighter, but it matters. Charles Buczynski was a serious painter. He painted throughout his life. In the Vermont farmhouse, in the gaps between productions, in the years when the industry had no particular use for him. Painting was, by his own rare admission, the one place where the discipline dropped and something else came through. He did not talk about what that something was, but he did not stop painting. He changed his name to Charles Bronson in the early 1950s. The explanation he gave, when he gave one, pointed to the McCarthy-era's particular hostility toward Eastern European surnames, the quiet professional calculation that Buczynski was a door some casting directors might not open. The new name came from a street or a prison, depending on which version of the story you heard. What it cost him to set down the name his father had carried from Lithuania, to file it away, to answer to something else, he did not discuss publicly. He had already learned not to discuss certain things publicly. He was adding to the list. The years between the name change and the first real breakthrough were long in the way that only Hollywood years can be long, measured not in months but in almost the verturals. Television work, supporting roles, the kind of parts that get you recognized on the street by no one. He had the wrong face for the leading man roles studios were casting in the 1950s. Too hard, too specific, too much of something that didn't fit the decade's preferred idea of charm. What the American studios couldn't place, however, the Europeans recognized immediately. French and Italian audiences understood the face before American ones did. By the mid-1960s, Bronson was a star in Paris, in a way he was not yet a star in Burbank. The Magnificent Seven came out in 1960. 7 actors, most of them already names: McQueen, Brenner, Coburn, Vaughn, and Bronson as Bernardo O'Reilly, the one who ends up protecting the village children, the one whose backstory carries the most unspoken weight. Critics noticed the face. Not everyone could say exactly what they were noticing, but the camera kept finding it. The Great Escape followed in 1963. Then Sergio Leone called from Italy. Once Upon a Time in the West was released in 1968, and Leone framed Bronson's face the way you frame a landscape, as something that existed before the story and would exist after it. Harmonica, the man with the mouth organ who has been waiting years to deliver a specific piece of justice. It was not a subtle character, but Bronson played it with a stillness that made the violence when it came feel like weather rather than action. Something that had been building since before the film began. Have you ever built something so carefully, a wall, a version of yourself, a way of moving through the world, that after a while you couldn't tell whether you were protecting something or just performing the protection? Leave a comment. Because by 1968, the wall and the man had become nearly indistinguishable. Death Wish opened in 1974. Bronson was 52 years old. The film made him the most commercially successful movie star on the planet for a period, not just in America, but globally. In markets that had been watching him for years already, he became a symbol for something specific about that decade. The ordinary man pushed past endurance, who stops waiting for the institutions to respond and responds himself. Critics were divided. Audiences were not. The film grossed enormous numbers and spawned a franchise that would define the rest of his career in ways that were not entirely in his control. He had married Jill Ireland in 1968, she had been married to David McCallum before, and the two families merged into something complicated and real. McCallum's 3 sons, the daughter Bronson and Ireland, had together named Zulanak and Katrina, whom they adopted. It was not a simple household. It was not a simple love. But it was, by every account that exists, hers in interviews and in print, his in the rare moments he confirmed anything, the organizing fact of his adult life, the thing that made the silence bearable, the person who knew what was behind it. In 1984, Jill Ireland was diagnosed with breast cancer. What the audience couldn't see from their seats, what the poster campaigns and the box office numbers and the carefully managed public image had never been designed to carry, was already beginning to change everything. Not loudly, not in any way that would show up in a trades announcement or a press release, just quietly, the way the most important things always begin. The NBC studios in Burbank had a particular quality at night, the kind of controlled brightness that exists nowhere else, where the set is fully lit and the space beyond the cameras is dark, and everything that happens in that room happens in a kind of deliberate isolation from the rest of the world. The Tonight Show taping began in the early evening. The audience was already seated when the guests arrived. The chairs were arranged at a specific angle to Carson's desk, close enough for conversation, positioned so that the camera could hold both faces. It was a room built entirely for the purpose of surfaces. Bronson had done this before. He had done versions of it for 30 years. The press junkets, the television appearances, the profile interviews where journalists came hoping for revelation and left with 3 complete sentences and a handshake. He was not hostile in these settings. He was something more unsettling than hostile. He was simply unreachable. The face that Leone had framed like a landscape was the same face in the interview chair, present, watchful, giving nothing away. Carson was good at this, good at finding the edge of what a guest would allow, good at the gentle persistence that loosened most people up. Most people. The lives are real. The conversation is imagined. What we know is this. By the mid-1980s, Jill Ireland's diagnosis was 14 months old. The treatment cycle had begun, the surgeries, the chemotherapy, the specific exhaustion of watching someone you love subjected to the cure as much as the disease. Bronson had learned to cook for her during this period. He accompanied her to treatments. He scaled back his work schedule in ways that were not announced and not discussed publicly, because announcing and discussing things publicly was not what he did. What he did was show up, quietly, repeatedly, without making it into a story. Carson asks something light about the new film, about the response overseas, about the particular quality of the action genre in the 1980s. Bronson answers in the way he always answers, precisely, briefly, without elaboration. The audience finds this charming. It fits the mythology, the man of few words, the face that doesn't move. Carson smiles and tries another angle. What does not come up? What will not come up? Because Bronson has already decided it will not come up before he walked out from behind the curtain, is Jill, the diagnosis, the mornings, the specific fear that has no name in the vocabulary of a man raised in the coal camps of Cambria County, where fear was something you folded into function and carried forward. He knows how to be afraid. He has been afraid before, in the tail gunner's bubble over the Pacific, in the years when the industry had no use for him, in the long specific silence after his father didn't come home from the shaft. What he does not know, what nothing in his life has prepared him for, is how to be afraid of this particular thing, because the tools that worked in every other context do not apply here. You cannot work harder. You cannot hold your face still enough. You cannot out-discipline a diagnosis. Carson leans forward slightly. That gesture he has, the one that signals genuine curiosity rather than performance, and asks something about whether Bronson ever gets nervous. The audience laughs, anticipating the answer. Bronson looks at him for a moment. Then he says something minimal and dry, and the audience laughs again, and Carson moves on. Have you ever sat in a room performing fine when nothing was fine, and had the specific experience of watching someone look right at you and not quite see it? Leave a comment. Because that is what that chair was on that particular night. He drove back to wherever Jill was waiting. That is what we know. What came after the parking lot, after the highway, after the door opened, that was the part that never made it onto a poster, and the part that defined everything. Jill Ireland died on May 18, 1990. She was 54 years old. The cancer had progressed through 6 years of treatment, surgeries, chemotherapy cycles, the particular cruelty of a disease that retreats and retreats again, and in the end, it did not retreat. Bronson was with her. He had been with her throughout. That part of the record is not ambiguous. He was 68 years old when she died. He had been famous for 16 years. He had been acting for 35. He had been Charles Bronson, the name, the face, the symbol, the wall, for the better part of 4 decades. And none of it was any use whatsoever on May 19th when he woke up in a house that had been reorganized around her absence. What do you do when the person who made sense of everything is no longer there to make sense of it? not as a philosophical question, as a Tuesday morning question, as a what do I do with my hands question. Think about that. And if you've been there, leave a word in the comments. He kept working. This should not be mistaken for resilience or recovery. It was more like reflex. The film commitments continued. The face appeared on screens. The industry that had used him as a symbol of self-sufficient masculinity for 2 decades was not particularly equipped to engage with what was actually happening to him, and he was not particularly interested in helping it try. The late films, the final Death Wish installments, the direct-to-video work of the early 1990s carried a different quality than the earlier work. Whether that quality was grief or age, or simply the natural arc of a career that had peaked under specific cultural conditions, is impossible to say with certainty. Probably it was all three. He married Kim Weeks in 1998. He was 76. She had worked with Jill during the illness, had been part of that household during the hardest years. What the marriage meant to him is not a matter of public record in any detailed way. He continued to paint. The Vermont farm, the property outside the small town of West Windsor that he had kept throughout his career as a counterweight to Los Angeles, remained the place he returned to. The garden, the canvases, the specific soft silence of a rural New England morning that has nothing to do with performance or symbol or legacy. The Alzheimer's diagnosis came in his late 70s. The disease progressed in the way it progresses, gradually, then less gradually. The particular cruelty of a condition that takes the person incrementally rather than at once. The man who had spent his life being unreachable became in those final years unreachable in a different and more complete way. The face that had been controlled for decades was still, but for different reasons now. He died on August 30, 2003. Pneumonia. He was 81 years old. His daughter Zulika was with him. The obituaries did what obituaries do. They reached for the highlights, the box office numbers, the Leone films, the Death Wish franchise, the face. They were not wrong. They were just incomplete, which is the condition of every obituary ever written about anyone who carried more than they showed. There is a version of Charles Bronson's story that fits neatly into the mythology. The boy from the mines who became the most watched face on the planet, the American archetype of the self-made man, the proof that silence and endurance are enough. That version is not wrong. It is just the surface. The surface was always the point. With Bronson, the surface was the achievement. What it cost to maintain it and what it was protecting is the actual story. What his life reveals is not about toughness. It is about the particular loneliness of people who learn early that showing the wound makes you a target and who spend decades becoming so skilled at concealment that they can no longer locate the door themselves. The coal camps teach you to function. The war teaches you to continue. The industry teaches you to perform. And none of it teaches you what to do when the one person who knew where the door was is no longer there to find it with you. The last image, Charles Bronson in the Vermont garden, alone with a canvas. No camera, no curtain to walk out from behind. No chair arranged at the correct angle for the shot, just the painting and the light and the particular quiet of a man who spent his entire life being looked at finally, in those hours, unseen. If this story meant something to you, leave a like, not for the algorithm, but because this man's life deserves to be remembered as more than a poster. Subscribe if you want more stories told this way, lives that carried more than they showed. And tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? Share this with someone who grew up learning to hold their face still. They'll know exactly what this is about. And one last thing, if you could say one thing directly to Charles Bronson right now, what would it be? Leave it below. He earned the words.